welcome to another edition of The Public Interest. I'm Gabriela Patram, and we're so happy that you can join us. With me is former President of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana and leader of the People's National Congress Reform, Mr. David Granger. Sir, welcome. It's always a pleasure to have you.
It's always a pleasure to be back. Thank you.
Sir, I want us to talk or discuss a little bit today. We're going to go into a little bit of history, which I know that you're very fond of. And it's going to be centered around the Demerara Martyrs Day, the rebellion and so forth. During your presidency, you would have declared Demerara Martyrs Day to commemorate the massacre of over 200 persons on the 20th of August each year. What were your thoughts or your motivation for this?
The most important thing, of course, is that that day, the 20th of August, 1823, saw the most severe or most massive massacre,
Yes.
not only in Guyana's history, but there's no equal in the British Caribbean during the days of enslavement. In fact, it involved over 11,000 persons who would march down from 55 plantations. This was before you had the internet and before you had social media. You can imagine in 1823, people were able to mobilize 11,000 persons who were enslaved at that time from 55 plantations. And they attempted to march to the city of Georgetown. They were stopped at Bachelor's Adventure, and they insisted on marching forward, and the British troops, insisted on holding them back and started to pump lead into them, and 200 persons were shot down. So it was the most massive massacre that I'm aware of in the Anglophone Caribbean. Not only that, there was, I would say, a lot of misunderstanding about the nature of the conflict, and up to the present time, I think that misunderstanding persists. At that time, General Murray was the governor of Guyana, British Guyana as it was then, and we had a Murray Street, and that was renamed Kwamina Street, as you know, in Cummingsburg, because it was thought that Kwamina was the intellectual leader of the revolt. But a lot of credit was given to John Smith, and most people remember the Reverend John Smith as the Demerara martyr, and in fact they don't remember the people who were actually killed. In fact, there's a church in Brigadier, a congregational church called the Smith Memorial Church, but I would say that he was not the intellectual author of the 1823 revolt, and it is a shame that the persons who actually revolted and the reason why they revolted have been completely obscured. I would say that commemoration is necessary in order to keep in the public imagination a recollection, or to have a true account of what occurred on the 20th of August, 1823. Something we should not forget, because the impact is on us today, and I do believe that by declaring 20th of August, 1823, helped to refocus attention on this important event in Guyana's history. I don't know why it ever was allowed to disappear, or why its importance was diminished. And even now, there has been some controversy about the location of the monument. Actually, there is a small monument in Bachelor's Adventure. That's where the massacre took place. It was built by the villagers themselves I think it's around the 180th anniversary a few years ago. It's nothing to look at, but it symbolized the villagers' connection with the past. Later on, the government built one by the seawall, and there was some controversy, and we had started to build a memorial at the parade ground. What happened is that the massacre took place at Bachelor's Adventure, and then there was a court-martial, and some of the persons who were convicted. And of course, in those days, you know, if you get court-martial, it's almost a sentence of death. And those remaining ones, not 200, the 200 were killed on the spot at Bachelor's Adventure. Others were brought down, court-martialed, and then the heads were cut off and stuck on poles around what we call the parade ground or Independence Park. So there's still some controversy, but the important thing about the commemoration is that this event should not be forgotten, and there are good historical reasons why we should celebrate it. And I hope this year it wouldn't be forgotten. I think some people have just ignored it in the past.
And sir, just for information purposes, they closed the 11,000 enslaved Africans from the 55 plantations. It varied from Linyandal to Mahaiko.
That's right.
From those plantations.
That's right, yes.
Okay.
All the way up to, I think, Anne's Grove, most of those, you know, Dutch Four, most of those plantations were involved. What I said just now is that, you know, without internet, without telephones, you know, they mobilized 11,000 people.
Sir, my next question to you is, what is the significance of this? Because next year, in 2023, we're going to be celebrating the 200th anniversary. What is the significance?
I would like it to be a national event. I think it would be a moment of healing and a moment of redefining ourselves as Guyanese. I don't want it to be seen as an African event. I don't want it to be seen as something connected with enslavement. I think it is important to link what happened on the 20th of August, 1823, with everything else that happened in the succeeding 15 years. And I would like the government, I would like the education system to embrace this event, let our children know what took place, because without that understanding, we will continue to have different narratives about that period, about the event in Guyanese history. I would like, Gabi, to link what happened then with what happened just a little over a year ago, what we call the Black Lives Matter movement. In fact, it didn't start with George Floyd. You know, many people thought it started with George Floyd. It started several years ago when, you know, white American policemen had set a bad reputation, a bad record of shooting, you know, African American citizens. So what happened last year in May is that when George Floyd was killed by the police, murdered, you know, people just started to connect the dots and say, look, this is too much. And the George Floyd riots or the Black Lives Matter movement, and there was an expression in this country, but it involved, you know, over 26 million people in 60 countries, in over 2,000 cities around the world. And I'm saying that although George Floyd did not set himself up as a martyr, that event triggered responses all around the globe. You had indigenous people in Colombia who started to pull down statues of the Spanish conquistadores. You had indigenous people in Australia. You had people in Britain, in the city of Bristol, which was a major port for the slave trade. There are people in Africa pulling down statues, you know, people in Belgium. It was a fantastic revolution. And in Guyana too, we are part of that Black Lives Movement, not as an African Guyanese statement, but as a statement of the injustices of colonialism. And that is why in 2 years' time, in 2023, I would like our commemoration of the bicentenary of the Demerara Martyrs to be that Black Lives Matter moment when all Guyanese, indigenous people, Portuguese, Chinese, Africans, Indians, must say this sort of thing must not happen. No, the legacy what happened with the George Floyd case, with the BLM movement, is that all around the world, persons who were victims of European colonialism and imperialism started to realize how their history had been distorted. And it was a sort of reawakening. And people started to say to themselves, we are not going to put up with this. And you had situations in what is now called the Democratic Republic of Congo, you know, where the Belgians would cut off people's hands if they didn't bring in enough latex, or in Namibia. And you have pictures now. Even the Germans are trying, well, Namibia used to be a German colony, but people are now questioning all forms of European colonialism because of the response globally to what happened in this Black Lives Movement. In my view, we must have a Black Lives Movement moment in 2023, when all Guyanese who've been victims of British imperialism would commemorate that day, and the people who have died in Guyana at the hands of the British.
Why is so little being taught, though, about the Demerara Martyrs Day or the movement?
That is a great paradox. Given its significance, its importance, I can only suggest it might be some form of intellectual or academic suppression.
Okay.
But our own scholars have written widely. Professor Winston McGowan perhaps has written the most lucid account of the Demerara revolt. You know, one from the point of view of the church, what is called the LMS, the London Missionary Society, which is now really, which has been replaced by the Congregational Union. And Kwamina, as you know, the headquarters of the Guyana Congregational Union is called Kwamina House up to this day. So the revolt was associated with them. But the official recognition has been scant. And there was an attempt, I know of that attempt, to have the books written by Professor McGowan accepted in the schools, and it was not accepted by the insert at that time. And a new effort has to be made. But once you're teaching history, you have to ensure that the research material is there and that students have access to. Nowadays, people are going away from the hard printed copies. They want to see films, they want to see, you know, video, and they want to have, you know, some digital version of history. But it is a pity that not only the Demerara Martyrs, the Demerara Massacre, is not being taught. For some reason or the other, much of the history of Guyana has not been taught. What happens is that the CXC syllabus, which is the main focus in secondary schools, is dominated by West Indian themes, you know, and people may leave knowing much about Antigua, Barbados, or Jamaica, but quite frankly, they don't know much about Guyana. And it is a blind spot in our academic curriculum, but it is something that needs to be taught even at primary schools, so that when they go into secondary schools and they're obliged to conform to the CXC syllabus, they still have that understanding about what took place in Guyanese history. It is not, the knowledge is not deep, but there is abundant historical material which the teachers could use, which students could use for research purposes, and it has to be explored more deeply. It is something that has to be rectified, and there are enough people who know enough about the Demerara Massacre to develop a curriculum so that it is taught more effectively in our schools, primary, secondary, and certainly at university level.
So my next question, you would have described the Demerara Massacre as the final act of freedom. But I found this interesting that actual emancipation occurred 15 years afterwards. What connects the 1823 Demerara Revolt, the 1833 Emancipation Act, and the actual emancipation in 1838?
Well, Gabi, those three events are linked.
Okay.
The severity of the suppression of the 1823 revolt, um, you know, I think in British colonial history, you know, there hadn't been a similar event in which 200 people had been massacred. So it did cause a furor in Britain. And at that time you had, you know, movements, you know, anti-slavery movement, you know, movement for the emancipation of African, or the termination of African slavery. And they were able to take it up in Britain. So it was eventually taken to the British Parliament. Now, in 1823, what happened is that there was no attempt to grant the enslaved Africans freedom. What was tried was the amelioration. They wanted to reduce the amount of lashes a slave would get, you know, or stop punishing females or reduce the amount of work. It was nothing to do with emancipation. But the Africans themselves on these, you know, throughout British Guiana, as it was, well, not quite British Guiana, the colonies, Demerara, Essequibo, and Berbice, they thought it was full freedom. And they thought that the planters were holding back the freedom. That's why they were marching to town to speak to the governor. So, because of the cruel way in which it was suppressed, people in Britain came to the conclusion that it was too expensive to maintain slave-grown sugar. At that time, other territories were being opened, producing sugar in Mauritius and East Asia, and it was uneconomical to produce sugar, well, cheaply at places like St. Kitts and Nevis, Antigua, you know, these small places. Countries like Cuba and Brazil were producing hundreds of thousands of tons, not 20 or 30 tons. And slave-grown sugar was uneconomical. So in any event, the emancipation of slaves was, I would say, almost a foregone conclusion. And within 10 years of 1823 revolt, the bill went to Parliament in the United Kingdom, and particularly the businessmen, the traders, who did not want expensive sugar. They wanted cheap sugar from East Asia, from Cuba, from Brazil, and other countries. And it was really driven in part by the desire of the industrialists and the manufacturers and the traders to have cheap sugar. The long and short is that by 1833, the Emancipation Act was passed, attempting to bring slavery to an end in 1834. Things didn't work out, as you know, when Damon in Essequibo was told that he had to go back to work on the same plantations under the same masters without money. If you know Essequibo very well, he said, no, this is not going to happen. And of course, he revolted as the Essequibo revolt. As you know, there's a statue in Anna Regina, and he was brought down to Georgetown, and he was hanged outside the public buildings in October of that year. The British attempted to introduce something called the apprenticeship scheme, in which, you know, the persons who had been enslaved up to the time of the Emancipation Act would continue to work on the same plantation without pay, under the same masters. And it became very unsatisfactory and very expensive. And the result is that by 1838, they decided to, you know, bring slavery to an end. So 1823 is connected to 1833 is connected to 1838. And Guyana, like the rest of the Caribbean, recognized 1838, not 1833, but 1838 as the formal ending of enslavement. Now, there was a link among the three because not only in the Guyana colonies, Demerara, Essequibo, and Berbice, but also in places like Jamaica and Barbados, the Africans were becoming restive, more restive, and the British had to keep deploying troops. You know, the British West Indies Regiment was one of the main military forces brought down. I think it might have been stationed in Jamaica at that time, to suppress revolts. So you don't only want cheap sugar, but you were bringing troops to make sure that the people who were producing the sugar were kept in subjection. And that became too expensive. And they turned to immigration. So long before emancipation, by 1834, they started to bring Portuguese. But not Portuguese, they actually came from Madeira. And by 1830, they started to bring people from India. They expected the Africans to walk off the plantations. That didn't quite happen. But in 1838, we commemorate the start of Indian immigration. And later on, of course, Chinese were brought. So you had Portuguese, Indians and Chinese coming in. Presumably to replace Africans in the plantations. It wasn't quite necessary, but that's the way they went. And they wanted cheap labor. And at least when the Indians and Portuguese and Chinese came, they did not have to bring down the British West India Regiment to suppress them the way they did suppress the African revolts. So in short, the nexus between the revolt, the Emancipation Act, and actual emancipation was a logical sequence which we should be aware of. And again, I deeply regret that this type of history is not taught to Guyanese, and there's not a clear understanding, because some people really thought we got emancipation in 1834, but it really was meaningless. The real emancipation didn't come until 1838.
So during your presidency as well, you would have declared Rose Hall Martyrs Day to commemorate the massacre of 13 workers this time on the 13th of March 1913. What is the historical role of political martyrdom in Guyana? I hope I'm pronouncing that word correctly.
You're quite right. It's not only Rose Hall or Demerara. Even after immigration started, the British had to use force to suppress disturbances on the plantations. And there were more massacres. Historically, the Demerara massacre was the worst in plantation, in the history of our plantations. But under the last administration, the coalition administration, the Department of Social Cohesion had started a process of investigating all of the scenes and events on the plantations. For example, there's one in Devonshire Castle, there's one at Rose Hall, as you said, and that was a larger revolt in terms of the amount of people killed by the police than even Enmore Martyrs. Again, it is a bit obscure, but the circumstances were much more violent than even Enmore. And I would say they had a greater claim to martyrdom. Enmore, is a bit controversial, but it became important because at that time political consciousness was rising in Guyana, and you had greater activism, and the funeral of the Enmore Martyrs was politicized, and that remained embedded in the public imagination. But there's a huge monument at Enmore built by the PNC many years ago, and that was meant to commemorate Enmore Martyrs. But there was also a massacre at Brimeveld when estate workers, at that time, Brimeveld was a plantation, and tried to march into town, and they were stopped and shot. Then there were a couple of riots at Leonora, and again, everywhere there was a plantation, there was some form of, even Newtonville on the East Coast. So the whole idea is that we should rectify history by looking at these revolts and determining the impact on what is happening in Guyana today. And it is my contention that unless you understand how British colonialism worked, you can't understand what is taking place in Guyana today. Because the racism that you see about us is not something we invented, it's something we inherited, And if we don't understand the origins and the sources of that racism, we continue to make the same mistakes, blaming one another. And the people who are to be blamed, are the Brits, who invented the system, who invented immigration, who invented, this cruel suppression of Africans and Indians, on the plantations. So we have to come to grips with history. And this is not a sideshow. This is central to understanding what is taking place in Guyana in 2021. And it is my view that unless we understand the antecedents of these events, we will not understand what's happening now, why Africans and Indians and Chinese and Portuguese have the type of relations they have now, and how we are going to solve the problem in future. My aim is at a solution. I don't want a repetition of what happened before. I'm not trying to stir up old grievances. I'm trying to create an understanding, and I think all students of history, and I'm not a historian, I'm a student of history, all students of history should try to understand what happened, and we should, have a more careful examination of these revolts, because they go to the heart of race relations in this country.
Well, sir, thank you very much for being with us today.
It's all over already.
It's all over.
But all I'm saying is that there must be a very critical examination, re-examination of our history.
Because we would have, a number of persons, including yourself, would have said that Guyana is full of rich culture and history, and a lot of us are descendants of
people who were enslaved or indentured. So I do hope that my responses to your question would have cast light on what essentially is a historical problem, but as far as I can see it, is a contemporary problem. And I'd urge present-day students, young people, I'd urge officials, I'd urge academics to come to grips with this aspect of Guyanese history so we'd solve our problems. And I hope that by 2023 we have a really good commemoration of this important event in Guyanese history.
Well, sir, again, thank you very much. This program was very edifying. It's always a pleasure to have you. And you're going to come back next week, right?
Sure.
And to your viewers, we say thank you very much for joining us. I'm Gabriela Patram, and on behalf of all of us here at Public Interest, we do encourage you, to follow all COVID-19 guidelines. Goodbye.
Cooperate for the young. Let us cooperate for our land. Let us resolve to work together. See we do it right together. Can we do it? Yes, we can.
Each man must do his